there, and I have office hours as usual on Thursday from 11:30 to 1:30. I would love to meet some of you. I'd love to hear what you think of the class so far. And this is a great way as you think about your future when you guys want to apply for jobs, apply for grad school, when you want letters of recommendation. Professors need to know you. Like, I need to know who you are, what you do, what your life is about, and so that involves you visiting me and talking to me and telling me a little something about your life. Okay. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today, but I'm hopefully going to illuminate what this book is doing for you. And I hope you enjoyed the second half, which I think gets even crazier and more bizarre than the first. And so I put up this quote, which we're going to return to. I think it's the most important quote of the book, which is, I'm really a very good man, but I'm a very bad wizard, I must admit. So the subtitle of today's talk is Fantasy as Ideology in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and that's kind of what we're going to pursue. But first, let me recap what we did on Thursday. So if you recall, at the end of last lecture, after presenting a variety of observations about the book and linking into some of the key themes that are at play, I made an argument. And that argument was that I am claiming that The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is a story about the cultivation of wonder or enchantment for what we've been calling the culture of abundance and its many expressions, while maintaining modern reason and rationality, right? So it's trying to balance two seemingly contradictory things, wonder and enchantment and reason in the modern world. But I argue that the book is also ambivalent about this balance, that it tends to move towards one side of that balance, towards wonderment more than rationality. And if you recall, I pointed out three moments or three qualities of the book, characteristics, that lead one to believe that this might be the case, that it might be ambivalent. So first I said the book itself is a product of the culture of abundance. It loves to show off. It loves to reveal all of its beautiful color. So even as it's trying to say you should cultivate reason and rationality, you should be a person in self-control as you encounter this abundant, lavish modern world of technology and commodities. Even as it says that, it says, buy me, read me, I'm so cool looking, I'm so beautiful, right? So second, I pointed out that the book's conceptual commitment to a nostalgic or idealized image of home, where home is pre-modern, free of the trappings of technology, supposedly authentic, not fake, right? That its commitment to that idea is really kind of inauthentic itself. Because Oz is so alluring, so beautiful, so amazing, why would anyone want to go home? And finally, I pointed out that through its characters, the book presents a variety of forms of reason or rationality, so that none of the characters actually have the same logic or agree in the same way. And so reason itself, which is supposedly universal, widely shared, suddenly seems actually diverse, multiplicitous, never identical with itself. So the other point I made is that all of these points that I've been, showing you here, that they function at the level of both form and content. And remember, we talked about form as the actual physical matter of the text you're looking at, and we talked about content as what that thing is about, right? So let me just give you a brief example before we move on and I elaborate on my argument from Thursday, right? So when Dorothy first sees the silver shoes, she shies away from them. She doesn't want anything to do with them. They're associated with a dead body that she's accidentally killed, right? And the Witch of the North gifts them to her, but she doesn't really care about them. She puts them on a table on the side. And when she returns to them later, the narrative says to us, at the moment Dorothy saw lying on the table the silver shoes that had belonged to the Witch of the East. This is when she's about to hit the road. She looks at her shoes. They're so tattered. They're so torn. She's like, this isn't going to work. And the narrative says, or she says, I wonder if they will fit me, she said to Toto. They would be just the thing to take a long walk in, for they could not wear out. She took off her old leather shoes and tried on the silver ones, which fitted her as well as if they had been made for her. So Dorothy looks at these shoes and she sees them not as beautiful, luxurious commodities, but as something that's just efficient and rational. I need shoes that won't wear out. It'll, you know, this is what I need. And yet the narrative visually presents us the shoes as though they are on display in a store, right? So in the original image, when the Witch of the North gives her the silver shoes, we get a very different image than what's actually described in the narrative. We get Dorothy displaying the shoes to us. This actually never happens in the story. She never displays the shoes. She just takes them and puts them on a table, right? So the actual form of the book, its imagery, is at odds with what the story is saying. And it's the narrator, him or herself, whoever the narrator is, it's omniscient, right? Who actually convinces us to start thinking of the shoes as though they were commodities. The narrator says when she puts on her shoes, they fit her as though they were made for her, right? Selling this idea of commodities that are made to fit. Like you went to someone and they made you these clothes, right? So this is one example of the way in which the story is showing ambivalence between reason, you know, I use these shoes because they're efficient, and then the idea of wonder, like I'm taken in by these shoes because they're so beautiful and extravagant. So what this argument that I've been making suggests, and this is what I'm really going to stress today, is that The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is a book that carries within it multiple, competing, overlapping, and sometimes totally contradictory ideas about the world. It does not have one clear and coherent message. In fact, it is responding to some of the contradictions of modernity itself that we talked about last week with its own contradictions. So that is to say, it conveys more than one ideology, and those ideologies are made apparent, as we've been pointing out, at the level of form and content. So I've used this famous buzzword that's totally important to cultural and literary studies, and that is the term ideology. How many people have heard of this word? Okay, almost everybody, right? But we all struggle so hard to define this term. It is one of the most contested, multiply defined words in the humanities. It is like the term modernity. But for the purposes of this class, this is what I'm going to have us understand ideology as. Ideology broadly refers to a set of commonly held beliefs or ideas, as well as the accompanying social and cultural practices of those ideas that together form a seemingly coherent worldview or way of life that is taken for granted as natural or universally shared. So an ideology constitutes a set of ideas and practices that appear natural or God-given or as though they're universal and we all, you know, take it for granted that they are true, right? Ideology is centrally about the way that particular understandings of the world serve specific interests and function to distribute power, privileges, and resources across the social field. So when we talk about ideology, we are almost always talking about power and power relations. So to give you an example that we're going to use constantly in this class, especially when we get to pulp fiction, science fiction. We might talk about the ideology of patriarchy, right? So patriarchy, which broadly refers to the idea of the domination of men over women. Patriarchy is an ideology that assumes that men are superior than women, right? As a natural or universal idea. It doesn't even question that, right? So when we point out that something is ideological or it is functioning like an ideology, we are speaking back to power. We are saying, actually, this idea is not universal. It's not natural. It was socially constructed. So Roland Barthes, who's a very famous cultural and literary theorist, he simplifies it this way. He says, ideology is the process by which history is turned into nature. And what he means is, ideology is the practice by which people take things that humans made, ideas that humans created, things that were socially constructed, and they make them appear as though they are universal. So there are a couple of famous approaches to ideology I want us to know. And the first one is the Marxist approach to ideology. So many of you have heard of Karl Marx, famous German philosopher of the 19th century, who produced the strongest and most elaborated theory of how capitalism works, right? And how the profit system works. And he is kind of the figure that we associate with the modern concept of ideology. So Marx thinks of ideology as a kind of social mask or cover that makes invisible what he understands as the real conditions of inequality in a given society, right? So he assumes that a shared or dominant ideology of any society is always the ideology of the people with money, power, privilege. And so in his conception, ideology is what he calls false consciousness. It is where certain groups of people believe in worldviews that do not help their own interests because they have been convinced by ruling classes that this is what they should buy into, right? This should be very obvious to you in the major political debates of our time, right? When people say, why is it that people who are in the working classes in America today are supporting conservative politicians who don't actually want them to be upwardly mobile, right? People buy into ideologies that don't necessarily serve their interests. And this is what Marx calls false consciousness. But in this class, we're not only going to be interested in ideology as this kind of cover, we're also going to be interested in another definition of ideology that post-Marxist approaches to culture have argued about, which is the idea that ideology can also encompass or include a variety of competing worldviews from many different political perspectives and investments. So in this view, ideology is not just false consciousness. It's not just like you're a dupe, you've watched a bunch of movies and bought into all these bad ideas about the world. It is also the scene of collective struggle where people contest or argue over what should be the shared values of a society, right? And this makes ideology much more energetic, lively, interesting, and this is what I'm going to argue that fantasy always does. Fantasy becomes a scene or a site upon which different ideologies can be contested, pitted against each other, in which we can actually have public collective debate. Right? And this is what Michael Saylor says that public spheres of the imagination did for people in the late 19th and early 20th century. If you recall, he says, these public spheres of the imagination allowed people to have competing ideas about the world in the same fictional narrative and to debate the merits of those ideas, right? All right. So this is something I'm going to leave you to kind of spend a little time with at home in the PowerPoint, but quickly, ideologies require certain basic things in order to function or in order to be successful or for people to believe them. So for instance, they require rhetorical or representational figures, meaning they require icons, buzzwords, things that make you remember them, right, when someone mentions that ideology. They require a social structure or institutions and modes of communications to aid in disseminating their central values, right? You cannot have ideology if you do not have things like governments, social structures, hierarchies, right? Schools, different institutions that sell you on different ideals. So think about where you're at right now. You're sitting in a classroom, you're sitting in an institution that we call the university that sells you, hopefully, on the ideology of a liberal education. What I mean by that is not liberal versus conservative, I mean the idea of a liberal humanist education. The idea that having conversations, dialoguing about ideas is a form of collective freedom. It supports things like democracy, egalitarianism, etc. That's an ideology, right? And it might be one that you do or do not buy into. But the institution of the university is one place in which that ideology gets circulated, right? And finally, ideologies require widely shared cultural narratives or stories that negotiate or attempt to reconcile apparent contradictions. People's lives are complicated, messy, all over the place. No ideology can ever capture the complexity of an individual's life. And yet, ideologies make life simple. They give us a seemingly coherent set of ideas or values to follow, right? So one of the things ideologies do is that they appear to reconcile the contradictions of our everyday lives. But there are moments, as we will see throughout this class, when people finally reach a moment where they cannot abide by a certain ideology anymore, when its contradictions become too visible, too apparent, and they refuse it. And this is when we see revolutionary politics, radical transformations in the world, resistance, social movements, etc. Okay? So the point I'm trying to make here, in a nutshell, is that we need to pay attention to ideology when we read these texts. We need to not be innocent. We need to say every single thing we're reading has a political stake. It is making a claim about the world. It's not just fun and games. The Wizard of Oz isn't just about like happiness and light and emeralds. It actually has its own ideology about the world. And that's what I'm going to do today, is I'm going to unpack that for you. All right. So today, I want to further develop the argument I made on Thursday. Specifically, I want to claim that the Wizard of Oz's dual interest in instilling wonder, yet cultivating reason, and its ambivalence about this project is framed by the book's competing commitments to two contradictory ideologies at the turn of the 20th century, and those are consumer capitalism and democracy. So the latter half of the book, the part that we just finished, the second half, dramatizes the conflict between these two ideologies or ways of life. But the book ultimately commits itself, I'm going to argue, to consumerism and to capitalism above democracy. And it does so by obsessing over the promise of upward mobility through wealth, power, and privilege above the ideal of collective political life, which is what appears to be the original promise of the book. So, ideology one. What am I talking about when I talk about consumer capitalism? So, consumer capitalism tells a story about the world, and that story is this. It says collective freedom is secured through the individual competitive pursuit of profit and the consequent ability to acquire goods that improve the quality of life. So the goal of consumer capitalism, as we're going to see in the early 20th century, is to sell the image of the good life and to suggest that the goal of life is material comfort. That's what we ultimately want, right? So like I said, all ideologies require figures, and here are some of the figures that should be very familiar to you of American capitalism and consumerism. The free market, the figure of the entrepreneur or businessman, and we're going to come back to this because the Wizard of Oz looks quite a bit like an early 20th century industrialist. The worker or the laborer, and also the concepts of hard work, initiative, and the concept of small government, right? The idea of unfettered private industry and the pursuit of profit. So what does this ideology promise? Why are people invested in it in the first place? Well, consumer capitalism says, guess what? If you commit to my ideology, you can be upwardly mobile, you can move up in the world, you can have better creature comforts, you can be free to consume whatever you want, and those commodities that you buy, the things that you buy, can help you reinvent yourself or refashion the self as you will, right? And finally, consumer capitalism promises, though we will see it rarely ever lives up to, the promise that it will fulfill all needs and wants. So we may ask, where do we see this in the book? And I'm going to skip ahead to show us a couple. I'll come back to that, right? So first of all, we see this in the book in the increasingly lavish visual spectacles of the color of the book, especially when we get to the land of Oz. So I don't know if you notice this, but once they get close to Oz, the images in the book become more and plentiful. They cover entire pages, right? So we get these double-page spreads of beautiful landscapes, large rooms, right? We get these descriptions of the rooms that they stay in when they're in the castle in Oz, and it's like they're at like the Ritz, right? There's like books and candles and clothing and silk and all of these objects, right? So there is the allure, first of all, of commodity culture, of owning all of these things. And if we remember, I'm going to come back to this, if Dorothy begins the story being like, I don't really care about the silver shoes as commodities, I just like really need something to walk in, by the end, she's like, I really want to own you, China doll. can I take you home? Right? So she's so invested in commodities by the end of the book. So second, the wizard makes all 4 of the main cast laborers of sorts, and he promises them gifts in exchange for their labor, for working. Remember, he says to Dorothy, quote, "You have no right to expect me to send you back to Kansas unless you do something for me in return. In this country, everyone must pay for everything he gets." I mean, this is kind of whacked out. I mean, I don't know if any of you noticed that. It's so interesting that he says, you have to work for me in order to get anything that you want. Even though he has, right, I'm going to come back to this, he has no claim to the throne of Oz. He just took it, right? So this is another way in which we see consumer, or the ideology of capitalism, is the idea of like, you have to work for everything that you get. So like, get laboring. Third, there is the upward mobility of the characters. The more that they do, the more that they get, right? By the end of the story, they begin feeling that they are missing things, right? By the end of the story, not only have they been gifted with actual physical objects that make up for the things they were missing, a heart, a brain, etc. They own kingdoms, my God. They have all become, you know, kings of the realm. So there is this idea that they worked hard and they get all of this stuff in return, right? So the ideology of consumerism is played out in this way. And finally, commodities do actually transform all the characters into what they had hoped to be. So it's like this straight shot, like, okay, I wanted a heart, I got it, and I'm happy now, right? So these are some of the ways in which consumer capitalism gets played out. But let's go back. There is a second ideology at play, as I'm arguing, and that ideology is democracy itself. So the central argument of democracy is very different than that of consumer capitalism. It is an ideology that suggests or argues that individual freedom is secured through the dissemination of political power to the people, or the masses, who are endowed with the right to collectively adjudicate the shape and structure of their society. And who are the central, or what are the central figures of this ideology? The people, the idea of the people. We're going to come back to this very often in this class, especially when we do the Hollywood musical. The idea of electoral politics, that you elect representatives to your government, right? The Constitution itself. The idea of citizenship, of belonging officially to a nation, and of course the concept of liberty. And what are the promises of democracy? They're different than the promises of capitalism, though they resonate with it. The idea of universal political recognition and an ever-expanding horizon of inclusion. Whoever is excluded, at some point, we will include them, right? This is the promise of democracy. Whoops, we made a mistake. Sorry, we left out African Americans. Sorry, we left out women, right? This fantasy that there's an ever-expanding horizon of inclusion. The idea of having a substantive stake in political life, having a say in how you are governed, right? And the idea that you are protected from tyranny. Okay, so this is a very different ideology from capitalism. And these two do not always work well together, although some people find ways to articulate them. Okay, so where do we see democracy in the book? I'm going to argue that the Wizard of Oz can be understood as representing a limited or flawed democracy. In fact, I would say it is less invested in an actual democracy. Nobody votes. There are no actual instituted representative governments in this book. Rather, there is this really amorphous idea of a democratic spirit in the book. The idea of like, we should do things together. Collective life is better than being on your own, right? We see this in the Band of Four themselves, who are a collective that bind themselves together to accomplish their goals. We see it in the representation of large collectives or of species in the field mice, the munchkins, the flying monkeys, and the creatures of the forest who actually have like a conference about what they want to do about, you know, the monster that's eating them. And of course, we said this last time, the dialogic nature of the book itself. Everybody talks to everybody. Everyone wants to get everyone's opinions, right? They call in the guard who used to watch over the wizard. They're like, what do you think we should do next, right? So these are some places where we see a democratic spirit in the book. But I'm going to ultimately say that there is no sense in which these collectives are actually truly democratic. There is no commitment, as I mentioned, to elective governments. Kingdoms are all ruled over. Nobody gets to elect who represents them except to choose another ruler. Slavery of all forms is rampant throughout Oz, and accidents of magic or history lead formerly free groups like the Flying Monkeys, like the Munchkins, or the inhabitants of Emerald City to be enslaved. It's because of an accident of history, right? Like that he flies in from Omaha, that suddenly the people who live in the Emerald Kingdom like are ruled over by this random circus performer, right? And similarly, people are freed accidentally. Like a house falls on the witch and then, oh, thank God, we're not enslaved anymore. You know, it's an accident. Nobody controls the political life of their social world. And that should disturb you. Like, that's really disturbing to me when I read this book. Only exceptional figures can speak truth to power, like our four main characters. Everyone else is mere background. The people are ineffectual and have no will for freedom from tyranny or the desire to rule themselves. And the four themselves are not really interested in freeing anybody they meet from rule, but rather from bad or unkind rulers, right? So if we remember, Dorothy never considers like, I should free the Flying Monkeys since I have the power to do that. Nobody ever thinks we should actively free these people so they can rule themselves. It's merely, you know, the person who's ruling them is not very nice. I would do it better, right? So this is what I'm gonna call benevolent supremacy, and I'm gonna come back to this idea in a minute. So I would say that the most pernicious or conservative aspect of the book is that it gives us the impression that it has revealed the ideological underpinnings of Oz, only to re-enchant us with the lures of commodity capitalism and upward mobility. So that's ultimately the claim I'm making here. The book gives you the impression that you have been released from ideology, from tyranny, from unfreedom, but it actually locks you into another form of unfreedom, which is the obsession with commodities and upward mobility. So how does the book train us to see through ideology? This, I think, is an amazing, this is actually where I give the book a lot of credit, which is that it actually is training children to read between the lines or to see through ideology. Give me 1 second, I'm grabbing some water. So first of all, it reveals totally explicitly the sham of the Emerald City. So I'm going to read a few lines, okay? I'm going to read a set of quotes. So on page 117, Dorothy asks, why do we have to wear these green spectacles? And the guard at the gate says, because if you did not wear the spectacles, the brightness and glory of the Emerald City would blind you. They are all locked on, for Oz so ordered it when the city was first built. So we see there is a form of top-down power, an ideological rule that says, like, you have to wear these glasses, right? So we're introduced to it on page 117. On 121, we actually live out the effect of this ideology, or of this law. Quote, with eyes protected by the green spectacles, Dorothy and her friend were at first dazzled by the brilliancy of the wonderful city. The streets were lined with beautiful houses, all built of green marble, and studded everywhere with sparkling emeralds. They walked over a pavement of the same green marble, and where the blocks were joined together were rows of emeralds. The window panes were of green glass. Even the sky above the city had a green tint. Does this remind anybody of anything we've seen before? Kansas is gray, the earth was baked gray, the grass is gray, right? Oz is supposed to be the opposite of the boring Kansas, and yet the ideology of the Wizard of Oz, which is that he wants to defend his position of power, right? It functions by making everything the same, by making everybody and everything do the same things, wear the same spectacles, see the world the same way, right? So if we're all looking through green glasses, this is like the phrase of like you're all looking through rose-colored glasses, we're essentially seeing the same thing. And that is what ideology does, is it's about like we all share the same belief structure. So later, it says, Dorothy leaves the city, right? And it says, Dorothy still wore the pretty silk dress she had put on in the palace. But now, to her surprise, she found it was no longer green, but pure white. The ribbon around Toto's neck had also lost its green color and was as white as Dorothy's dress, right? And finally, a little bit later, when this actually gets explicitly revealed, the wizard says, I'm going to come back to this quote because I think it's so amazing and messed up. He says, just to amuse myself and keep the good people busy, I ordered them to build this city and my palace, and they did it all willingly and well. Wow, like that should really blow your mind. Then I thought, as the country was so green and beautiful, I would call it the Emerald City, and to make the name fit better, I put green spectacles on all the people so that everything they saw was green. This is exactly the operation of ideology. He says, I based my decision on the natural world. It just was so green, I thought everybody should wear green glasses and the city should be green, right? He cannot admit that these are decisions that he made to maintain his own power, right? So the book shows us in all these passages, little by little, how to read between the lines. We look at that moment when she looks at her dress and it's white, and what do we think? We have to take a second, we have to say, wait a minute, is something happening here? Is this a lie, right? So the book, in a sense, trains us to see through ideology. It also does this, of course, by revealing the false wizard himself and even his many tricks. We learn every single ruse that he played out, right? That the fireball was a big ball of cotton set on fire, right? That the beautiful lady that he appeared as was just a mask and a dress, etc., right? And we also see the labor behind such illusions. When the wizard and Dorothy have to make an air balloon, right? We get an elaborate description of them doing the work of making it. And there are even literal references to the wizard manipulating the hearts and minds of the characters, right? So there's the quote, so the wizard unfastened the head of the scarecrow and emptied out the straw. Like, this could not be more direct. Ideology, right? I took his head off and I put new brains in his head, right? Like, I actually manipulated everything that you think. I put something else in your head, right? So the story actually literalizes the work of ideology, of convincing people to buy into a line, you know, that structures things in a certain organization of power. So here's what I think is so, as I said, is so dangerous and interesting about this book. Even as it reveals all of these ruses and ideologies to us, the revelation itself, the admission that all of it is fake, is the reason that we buy it, right? Because we feel that the book has told us the truth, so we're willing to buy anything else it says. And the worst thing that we are willing to buy is that the Wizard of Oz is not really a bad man, he's just a bad wizard, right? Like, that is the lie of the book that we then buy, because, well, he admitted that he was faking the whole time. So first of all, one of the ways that the book succeeds in selling us on this idea is that it pits the Wizard of Oz against a villain so spectacularly evil, the Wicked Witch, that he appears benevolent or generous and kind in comparison to her. It also frames the witch's rule as a form of enslavement, whereas his rule of the people of Emerald City is like just benevolent supremacy. Well, I'm really nice to them. They don't mind that I've lied to them and made them build this city, etc., right? This is also deeply gendered. In a book in which women seem to have so much power, by the end, everything is reversed. It is Dorothy who abandons all the trappings of upward mobility. She owns no kingdom. She goes back to Kansas. It is the men who rule over the world. It is the Wizard of Oz who is not made culpable for anything that he does. He is able to say, I was just a bad wizard, right? You can almost imagine that he's like, you know, some corrupt member of a Fortune, like, you know, CEO of a Fortune 500 company being like, I didn't know that they were doing that with all the stocks. Like, sorry, I'm leaving now to my island that I own. So the Witch and the Wizard of Oz are actually incredibly similar. And in fact, the text continually makes us see that they are like each other. They both rule unfairly. They both demand those beneath them to labor in their service. And they both deploy forms of second sight to see everyone but not be seen, right? So this is one major mechanism of their power. They are always watching over others, but nobody can see what they do, right? She has that eye. So we have, where is it? This picture, right? He is this big head with these big eyes and he's watching everyone. And she also has this big eye that functions like a telescope. So a great example of this is that when she captures Dorothy and she makes her work, the narrative says, Dorothy followed her through many of the beautiful rooms in her castle until they came to the kitchen, where the witch bade her clean the pots and kettles and sweep the floor and keep the fire fed with wood. But the irony of this, we read this and we just think, you know, this woman is so horrible. She's enslaved this poor little girl. But if we think about it, this is also the description of Emerald City. It's a beautiful castle, right? At the center of the city, there's a beautiful castle filled with beautiful rooms. There are all of these people who live there who cook, clean, sew, make things, right? But none of that is ever described in the language of drudgery or enslavement. There is this way in which the text paints the wizard himself as benevolent and loving and masks over ideologically, right, the disparity between these two forms of tyranny. And of course, the wizard himself has asked her to do far worse work than clean dishes and sweep a floor. He tells her to go kill her. He's like, go kill the witch. That's what I want you to do, right? So this is what's so interesting is that we don't, when you read it, I'm sure none of you were like, oh, he's so evil, right? We don't even think about it. It's like we just buy the story hook, line, and sinker. So, worse than this, and I would say this is like the most important point here, is that ultimately the book valorizes innocence as the one value that makes the ideology of consumer capitalism palatable or acceptable. It is the people in the narrative who claim innocence. Well, I didn't mean to do it. Well, I just landed in Oz by accident. Well, my house just fell on her by accident, right? It is all the characters who claim innocence who are ultimately celebrated because, of course, they have wonder, they have enchantment, and you need innocence to imagine things in an enchanted way in this story. So on Thursday, I had said, remember, I had said that wonder and enchantment is one affect. It's one response to the world that can make you open to possibilities. When you see magical or enchanted phenomenon, when you see new ways of socially relating that kind of enchant you, all these possibilities are opening up. So what I'm arguing here is that The Wonderful Wizard of Oz takes enchantment, it harnesses wonder, and it links it to the ideology of consumerism. So it actually limits the possibilities of wonder. It says, if you're gonna wonder about anything, you should feel enchanted by money, power, and privilege. This, by the way, is not the only way we can read this story, and I'm gonna offer a counter reading in just a second. So remember, Dorothy's repeated claims that she killed the witch by accident. She says, she throws the bucket of water on her, and she says, I'm very sorry indeed, said Dorothy, who was truly frightened to see the witch actually melting away like brown sugar before her very eyes. Again, commodities, sugar, food, like everything is described in the language of commodities. Didn't you know water would be the end of me? Asked the witch in a wailing, despairing voice. Of course not, answered Dorothy. How should I? How should you? You watched her for 4 weeks and she never touched water. Right? The story tells us in elaborate detail. It's like she avoided water at every moment. She didn't want to touch it, etc. This innocence extends to a really messed up part of the book, which is that Dorothy and her companions are made complicit in the lie of the Wizard of Oz in order to get what they want. So in exchange for the wizard giving them a heart, a brain, courage, and a trip to Kansas, they agree to, quote, say nothing of what they have learned. Even Dorothy had hope that the great and terrible humbug would find a way to send her back to Kansas. And if he did, that she was willing to forgive him anything. So even Dorothy buys in to this idea by the end of the book, that she doesn't need to free any enslaved people if she can get what she wants. So let's remember that even after they uncover, so this is, she throws the water, innocence, etc. Even after they uncover the entire ruse of the Wizard of Oz, they retain their green spectacles and never question the law that forbids them from taking them off. So if we go back for a second, right, let's see, where is it? Did I skip it? So this is a good moment. I don't think I have the picture I was thinking of. Oh no, it's the first one. Right, when they're in the chamber and they're talking to him, they've revealed the ruse. They've revealed that he is behind a screen, but they're still wearing the glasses even after he tells them it's fake. So if you recall, when she, I think I may have mentioned this, when she and the wizard create the balloon, like they spend all that time laboring to make the balloon that's going to take them to Kansas, it keeps describing the strips of fabric as different colors of emerald, but we know that's not true. The only reason that it looks like emerald is because she still has the glasses on. So she already knows that it's a lie, and she still buys it because she's like, I'm going to Kansas, I really don't care. By now, she knows the trick, and she believes it, right? Which is one of the ideological functions of fantasy, is that I know it isn't true, but even so. So, right, if we go back to that idea of the Wizard of Oz is not a bad man, but a bad wizard, we remember that he says that he did all of this just to amuse himself. And the innocence of that statement allows us to ignore the fact that for one man to amuse himself by ruling an entire people is what we define as tyranny. So, and the final quote that I want to give is, right, he gives them everything they want. He tells them, he's like, I can't give you courage. I can't give you a brain. These are not things that somebody can give to you. You have it in you. And they say, I want it anyway. I know it isn't true, but even so, right? And this is one of the functions of commodity capital. We know that a movie isn't true, but we still pay the money to fantasize for 2 hours in a movie theater, right? We still buy into this idea. And the quote says, Oz, left to himself, smiled to think of his success in giving the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman and the Lion exactly what they thought they wanted, right? And so again, he is not to blame for anything, for the ruse. They wanted it anyway. I gave them what they wanted, right? So if innocence was the very quality that the book initially associated with wonder and enchantment, it is ultimately what becomes the vehicle for forwarding a deeply problematic and unfair ideology of unequally distributed privilege and power. And my point in making this critique of the book is not to say that The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is good or evil or bad or etc., but to say that it struggles, it is a scene of struggle or conflict between the competing ideologies of consumerism and democracy. And as I've argued, I think consumerism wins out. Now, there is a glimmer of hope at the end. I'm going to take us to the last slide. In the fact that Dorothy is the one, our lead character, who abandons the trappings of upward mobility. She doesn't want to stay in Oz. She doesn't care that she loses the silver slippers on her trip home. She just wants to be home. So what began as a kind of nostalgic longing for home, I would suggest, ends as the one little symptom of a glimmer or possibility of critiquing or turning away from consumerism. So the point that I wanted to make today in doing this reading of The Wizard of Oz, to reiterate something I said earlier, is the idea that every text that we're going to engage is going to have these competing ideologies at play. And some of those will work together and some will not. But the key here is that cultural texts rarely, if ever, carry a single ideological agenda. Unless something is propaganda, it's not selling you on one idea. You can't read it in one way. So this is why I'm sure some of you have come into this class having heard of the famous gold standard reading of this book, that it's really about the battles over silver versus gold and like at the turn of the 20th century and the monetary system. This is one of many readings, but it is a reading that reduces the meanings of the book to one thing. So what I've tried to show you instead is that this book is playing with many different ideologies and responding to many historical transformations at the turn of the century. So these texts that we're going to engage from now on, we're going to continually point out that they are riven by contradiction, ambivalence, and conflict in much the same way that the world is riven by contradiction. Essentially, these texts not only carry multiple and competing ideas, but are themselves an attempt to negotiate or come to terms with larger social and political contradictions in modern American society. So it's going to be our job as we move forward to read cultural texts as political, as making a claim about the world and how we should inhabit it. So on Thursday, what we're going to see is that Little Nemo in Slumberland is doing many of the same things that The Wonderful Wizard of Oz does. It takes us to a magical world slumberland filled with amazing commodities, but unlike the Wizard of Oz, it is actually going to show you how dangerous and how much we should question that world and its promises. And that's going to be part of the fun of reading kind of across the board over the history of Little Nemo. So I will see you Thursday.